She's not ready for this table. The words didn't slip. They landed, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the quiet hum of crystal glasses and low conversation like a verdict already decided. No one corrected him. No one even blinked. At a private dining room overlooking Manhattan's skyline, where deals worth hundreds of millions were negotiated over dry-aged steak and imported wine, Danielle Carter sat at the far end of the polished walnut table, dressed in a simple black blazer, no jewelry, no designer logos, nothing that announced who she really was. And that was intentional. Across from her, the Whitmore family, old money, generational wealth, the kind of power that didn't need to raise its voice, leaned back in their chairs like the room already belonged to them. Richard Whitmore, the patriarch, swirled his glass slowly, eyes barely meeting hers as if acknowledging her directly would somehow lower his status. Beside him, his son Daniel smirked, flipping through the deal summary without once looking in her direction. "We expected someone more senior," Daniel added, the pause before the last word stretching just long enough to say everything he didn't. A quiet chuckle rippled around the table. Subtle, controlled, but loud enough. Danielle didn't react. Not when the waiter placed her untouched glass of water in front of her while pouring wine for everyone else without asking. Not when the lead attorney shifted his chair slightly away from her, angling his body toward the Whitmores like she wasn't even part of the negotiation. She simply sat there, still, composed, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly on the table as if anchored to it. Because she had seen this before. Not this room, not these people, but this exact moment. Years ago, in a different boardroom, smaller, colder, where a banker once told her she didn't fit the profile for a $2 million line of credit despite having triple the collateral. She remembered the silence then too. The same kind of silence. The kind that wasn't empty. It was filled with assumptions. Back in the present, Richard Whitmore finally spoke again, glancing briefly in her direction like she was a formality he had to get through. "Why don't you have your boss join us when you're ready to move forward?" he said, his tone calm, almost polite, which somehow made it worse. Around the table, heads nodded. Agreements without thought. Judgments without questions. Danielle's gaze moved slowly across each face, memorizing them, not with anger, but with precision. Every smirk, every dismissive glance, every moment they chose to underestimate her. Because this wasn't new, and it wasn't accidental. It was a pattern, one she had learned not to interrupt, one she had learned to let play out fully. The city lights reflected faintly in the glass behind them, stretching endlessly into the night. But inside that room, the air felt smaller, tighter, like everything was compressing toward a single point. Danielle reached for the document in front of her, flipping it open with quiet control, her movements unhurried, almost indifferent. She didn't correct them. She didn't introduce herself. Not yet. Because the most powerful move wasn't proving them wrong too early. It was letting them be wrong long enough that it cost them something they couldn't recover from. The room did not reset after the comment. It settled into it, like everyone had silently agreed on a version of reality where Danielle Carter did not belong at that table. And the longer that version held, the more comfortable they became living inside it. A server returned with a tray, placing plates in front of each guest with careful precision, announcing each cut of meat and preparation as if narrating importance. But when he reached Danielle, there was no description, just a quiet placement, quick, efficient, forgettable, and she noticed that too, not as an insult on its own, but as part of a pattern that had already been decided before she ever walked in. Daniel Whitmore leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the side, flipping through the contract again with exaggerated disinterest. "So let us be clear," he said, tapping the paper lightly. "This deal does not move forward until we speak with someone who actually has authority." The word authority hung in the air longer than it should have, stretching across the table like a line no one questioned. A few heads nodded again. One of the investors, an older man in a navy suit, adjusted his glasses and added, "It is standard practice. Nothing personal." But everything about it was personal, even if they refused to name it. Danielle lifted her glass of water slowly, taking a measured sip, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady, not defensive, not offended, just present, and that presence unsettled something subtle in the room, though no one said it out loud. Because she was not reacting the way they expected. No apology. No correction. No attempt to prove herself. Just silence. And silence, in a room like this, was either weakness or control, and they had already decided which one they were seeing. At the far end of the table, a junior analyst named Ethan Cole shifted in his seat, his eyes moving between Danielle and the name printed at the top of the document in front of him. He had read the briefing twice before coming in. He had memorized the structure of the deal, the capital flow, the approval chain. And something was not lining up. He glanced again at the signature page, then back at Danielle, his brow tightening slightly. But he said nothing, not yet, because speaking up in a room like this required more than certainty. It required courage, and he was not sure he had enough of it. Richard Whitmore set his glass down with a soft but deliberate sound. "We do not waste time here," he said, his voice calm but final. "So if your role is to relay information, we can pause this meeting until your leadership is available." Around the table, chairs shifted subtly, bodies leaning back, already preparing for the exit, already dismissing her without ever truly engaging. Danielle closed the document in front of her with quiet precision, aligning the edges perfectly with the table as if she were organizing more than just paper. Her gaze moved once more across the room, slower this time, deliberate, as if locking each face into memory. The skyline outside had deepened into a darker blue, the city lights sharper now, more defined, but inside that room, the atmosphere had grown heavier, not louder, just more certain in its misjudgment. And still, she said nothing, because they were not done yet. And neither was she. The shift in the room did not happen all at once. It moved in small, almost invisible ways, like a current changing direction beneath still water, and Danielle could feel it without looking for it. Because this was the moment where assumptions either hardened into certainty or began to crack under their own weight. Daniel Whitmore leaned forward again, this time sliding a revised copy of the agreement across the table, stopping it just short of Danielle's reach, as if even that distance mattered. "When your supervisor is available," he said, his tone measured, controlled, almost bored. "We will revisit this with someone empowered to sign." The paper sat there between them, untouched, a physical symbol of everything they believed she was not. Around the table, the others followed his lead, conversations shifting slightly away from her, voices lowering but not enough to exclude her completely, just enough to make it clear she was no longer central to the discussion. One investor began discussing market timing with Richard, another checked his watch, subtly signaling that this meeting had already been downgraded in importance. Danielle remained still, her eyes resting on the document for a brief moment before lifting again, not to argue, not to interrupt, but to observe, to let the full weight of their dismissal settle exactly where it needed to. Across from her, Ethan Cole's discomfort grew harder to hide. He flipped through his own copy again, slower this time, his finger tracing the signature block at the bottom, then moving up to the executive summary where the originating firm was clearly listed. Carter Global Holdings. He swallowed, glancing at Danielle again, then at Richard Whitmore, then back down, the realization forming piece by piece but not yet spoken. Because if he said it out loud, everything in the room would have to stop, and stopping meant admitting something had already gone wrong. And no one in that room was ready for that. Richard Whitmore continued speaking as if nothing needed to be corrected, outlining expectations, timelines, conditions, all directed to the air above Danielle rather than to her directly. "We expect responsiveness at this level," he said. "Decisiveness, clarity, leadership." Each word landed like a quiet contradiction, describing exactly what she was while denying her the recognition of it. Danielle's expression did not change, but something behind her stillness sharpened, not visible, not dramatic, just precise. She adjusted the position of her chair slightly, not to move away, but to align herself more directly with the center of the table, a subtle correction that no one acknowledged but everyone felt. Because presence, when it refuses to shrink, becomes impossible to ignore, even when people try. Daniel Whitmore exhaled softly, tapping his fingers once against the table. "Let us not complicate this," he added, glancing briefly at her for the first time with something that resembled impatience. "You are here to take notes, that is fine, but do not pretend this is your decision to make." The words were calm, almost casual, but they carried a finality that suggested the conversation was already closed. For a moment, the room held that assumption like a shared agreement. And then something subtle shifted again. Not from Danielle. From the edges of the table. Ethan straightened slightly in his seat, his voice not loud, not confident, but clear enough to exist. Actually, he said, the words slipping into the space before anyone could stop it. The authorization structure on this deal. He paused, just for a second, feeling every eye begin to turn toward him, the weight of hierarchy pressing down. Danielle did not look at him. She did not need to, because the room was finally beginning to do what it should have done from the start. Pay attention. The word hung there for half a second too long, just enough to disrupt the rhythm of control that had settled over the room. And for the first time since the meeting began, the attention shifted away from the Whitmores and landed somewhere unexpected. Ethan Cole cleared his throat quietly, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of his document, as if grounding himself in something factual before continuing. The authorization structure on this deal, he repeated, more carefully now. It lists final approval under Carter Global Holdings executive signatory. The room did not react immediately, but the silence that followed was different from before, less confident, less unified, like something unseen had just entered the conversation. Daniel Whitmore's expression barely changed, but his eyes flicked briefly toward Ethan, then toward the document in front of him, scanning it again with a sharper focus than before. We are aware of the structure, he said, his tone clipped, dismissive, attempting to close the gap before it widened. Which is why we are asking for someone authorized. Ethan nodded slightly, but did not sit back down into silence the way he might have earlier. Yes, he said, his voice steadying just enough, but the name attached to that authority. He stopped again, not because he did not know, but because saying it would force a shift no one had prepared for. Around the table, subtle movements began to ripple. One investor leaned forward slightly. Another glanced down at his own copy of the agreement. The attorney who had angled his chair away from Danielle earlier now adjusted it back by a fraction, not fully, just enough to suggest reconsideration without admitting it. Danielle remained still, her gaze forward, not acknowledging Ethan, not encouraging him, not interrupting the moment as it unfolded exactly the way it needed to. Because this was the point where the room began correcting itself. Slowly, reluctantly, and with just enough resistance to make it real. Richard Whitmore's hand rested on the table, fingers no longer moving, his glass untouched now. He looked down at the document in front of him, flipping one page back, then forward again, his eyes narrowing slightly as he traced the signature line with more attention than before. The confidence that had filled his posture earlier did not disappear, but it shifted, tightening at the edges, becoming more deliberate. Ethan, he said calmly, though there was a faint edge beneath it now. If you have something to say it clearly. The room stilled again, but this time not in agreement, in anticipation. Ethan exhaled slowly, his voice quiet, but no longer uncertain. The signatory listed here, he said, tapping the page lightly, is Danielle Carter. The name landed differently when spoken out loud. Not dismissed, not overlooked, just present. And once present, it could not be easily ignored. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Daniel Whitmore looked up from the document, his eyes finally settling fully on Danielle, not in recognition yet, but in calculation. The investor beside him leaned back slightly, processing. The attorney's pen stopped mid-note. Even the ambient noise of the restaurant beyond the private room seemed to fade, as if the space itself had tightened around that single realization. Danielle did not move. She did not confirm. She did not deny. She simply sat there, exactly where she had been the entire time, her presence unchanged, her silence no longer invisible but unmistakable. Because now the room was beginning to understand that the question was no longer whether she belonged at the table. The question was why they had assumed she did not. The name did not echo, it settled, heavy and immovable, like something the room could not push aside no matter how hard it tried. And for the first time that night, silence did not belong to Danielle, it belonged to everyone else. Daniel Whitmore's fingers, which had been tapping with quiet confidence moments ago, stopped completely, resting flat against the table as if even small movements now required permission. Richard Whitmore leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on the document in front of him, but no longer reading it, Not really, because the words had already shifted meaning. Danielle Carter. The same name that had been dismissed minutes ago now sat at the center of a $900 million decision, undeniable, printed in black ink that did not change based on opinion. Still, no one spoke directly to her. Not yet, because acknowledgement meant admission, and admission meant they had misread the room in a way that cost more than pride. One of the investors cleared his throat quietly, adjusting his posture as if resetting his role in the conversation. The attorney reached for his pen again, but did not write, his eyes flicking between Danielle and the contract, as if recalculating something that should have been obvious from the start. Daniel Whitmore finally exhaled, a controlled breath, and leaned forward again, though the ease he carried earlier was gone, replaced by something tighter, more cautious. That may be the listed signatory, he said slowly, choosing each word with care. But we have not received confirmation that you are acting in that capacity for this negotiation. It was not a denial. It was a delay, a final attempt to regain structure before the reality fully settled. Danielle's gaze met his for the first time without any obstruction, steady, direct, not confrontational, but absolute. She did not answer immediately. She let the question sit in the same silence they had placed on her earlier, letting it stretch just long enough to remind them what it felt like to wait for validation that should not be required. And in that space, something deeper surfaced, not in the room, but within her. A memory. Not loud, not dramatic, just clear. A younger version of herself standing in a glass office years ago, documents in hand, listening as a senior executive explained that she was not the right fit for high-level negotiations. The words had been polite then too. Professional, measured, but the meaning had been the same. Not ready, not qualified, not belonging. She had not argued then either. She had walked out, built something stronger, something undeniable. And now, sitting at a table where the stakes were, measured in hundreds of millions, the language had not changed, only the scale had. Danielle's voice, when it finally came, was calm, even, carrying no trace of frustration, only clarity. You have already received confirmation, she said, her tone steady, precise. You just chose not to recognize it. No one interrupted. No one corrected her. Because the truth, once stated that simply, did not need support. Richard Whitmore's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition of something slipping beyond his control. Around the table, the subtle shifts continued. Chairs angled differently. Eyes no longer avoided her. The hierarchy they had assumed at the beginning of the evening was no longer holding. And yet, even in that shift, there was resistance. Because accepting her authority meant accepting that everything leading up to this moment had been a mistake. Danielle did not press further. She did not need to. The room was already moving, slowly, reluctantly, toward a realization they could no longer avoid. And the cost of that realization had only just begun to unfold. The balance of the room had shifted, but it had not yet broken, and everyone sitting at that table could feel it. That fragile moment where control either returns or collapses completely, and no one wanted to be the first to admit which direction it was going. Daniel Whitmore straightened his posture, adjusting his cufflinks with deliberate care, a subtle attempt to reassert the authority he had carried so easily just minutes before. Then let us proceed professionally, he said, his tone smoother now, recalibrated, as if the earlier comments could be folded away and forgotten without consequence. If you are indeed the acting decision-maker, we can continue the discussion on revised terms. The words were careful, almost respectful, but they carried an unspoken expectation that the past 10 minutes could simply be erased. Danielle did not respond immediately. Her eyes rested on him for a brief second, not questioning, not challenging, just measuring. Because this was the moment where most people rushed to re-engage, to reclaim space, to prove they belonged. But she had already learned that the most powerful move was not stepping forward. It was deciding whether the table still deserved her presence at all. She reached slowly for her phone, not with urgency, not with hesitation, just with intention. The movement was small, almost quiet, but it drew attention in a way no raised voice ever could. Across the table, Richard Whitmore noticed first, his gaze sharpening slightly as he watched her unlock the screen with calm precision. "Is there an issue?" he asked, his voice controlled, but no longer fully steady. Danielle did not look up immediately. She scrolled once, then tapped a single contact. When she spoke, her voice was low, even, carrying across the table without effort. "Emily," she said, addressing her executive assistant, "please prepare the withdrawal notice for the Whitmore transaction. Full cancellation. Effective immediately." There was no pause for reaction, no space for negotiation, just a clean instruction delivered as if it had already been decided long before this meeting began. On the other end, Emily's response came through faint but clear. "Understood. Initiating now." Danielle ended the call and placed the phone gently back on the table, aligning it beside the contract as if it belonged there all along. For a second, no one moved. Not because they did not understand, but because they did, and understanding made it real in a way denial could not protect them from. Daniel Whitmore leaned forward sharply, the composure he had rebuilt cracking at the edges. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," he said quickly, his voice tightening. "We are in the middle of final negotiations. Decisions like that require." Danielle raised her hand slightly, not to silence him aggressively, but just enough to stop the sentence from finishing. And it worked. Instantly. "No," she said, her tone unchanged. "They do not." The simplicity of the statement landed harder than anything louder could have. Around the table, the investors shifted again, but this time not in dismissal, in concern. The attorney finally spoke, his voice cautious. "If this deal is withdrawn, there may be implications on both sides." Danielle turned her gaze toward him briefly, acknowledging the comment without giving it weight. "There will be implications," she replied. "Just not for my side." Richard Whitmore exhaled slowly, leaning forward now, the authority he once carried replaced by urgency he could not fully conceal. "Ms. Carter," he said, using her name for the first time with intention, "we may have started on the wrong footing, but that is no reason to walk away from a $900 million opportunity." Danielle's expression did not change. "It is exactly the reason," she said. And in that moment, the room did not just shift. It began to collapse. The word reason did not echo. It settled with a finality that could not be negotiated. And for the first time that evening, no one at the table had an immediate response ready, because this was no longer about terms or leverage or timing. It was about something far more uncomfortable, something they could not rewrite with legal language or smooth over with revised clauses. Daniel Whitmore leaned back slowly, his earlier confidence now replaced by calculation that came a moment too late. "We can correct the tone," he said, his voice measured but edged with urgency. "Whatever miscommunication happened here, we can move forward." Miscommunication. The word hovered in the air like a weak attempt to rename something that had been clear from the start. Danielle's gaze remained steady, not hardened, not emotional, just precise, as if she were listening to a version of events that did not match the one she had experienced in real time. Around the table, the others began to shift more visibly now. One investor closed his folder halfway, uncertain. Another leaned forward, as if proximity might somehow pull the deal back into reach. The attorney spoke again, softer this time. "There is still value on both sides here," he said carefully. "Walking away may not serve either party in the long term." Danielle let the words pass without interruption, then finally spoke, her voice calm, but carrying a weight that settled deeper than anything said before. "Value is not just numbers on a page," she said, her tone even. "It is how you measure the people sitting across from you before the numbers are even discussed." The room stilled again, but this time not from uncertainty, from recognition. Because what she said could not be challenged without exposing exactly what had happened. Richard Whitmore leaned forward, his hands now resting firmly on the table, the last trace of distance gone. "Then allow us to reset," he said, his voice controlled but unmistakably strained beneath the surface. "We acknowledge that this conversation did not begin the way it should have. Let us start again." Danielle looked at him for a moment, not dismissing him, not accepting, simply evaluating the request as if it were any other term in a contract. And then she shook her head slightly, once, enough to end the possibility without raising her voice. "You already showed me how you start," she said. No one moved. No one spoke. Because that was the sentence that closed the door more completely than any formal cancellation ever could. Ethan Cole sat frozen, his eyes fixed on the table, understanding now that he had witnessed something far larger than a negotiation, something that would not be written into the official summary of the meeting, but would be remembered long after the numbers were forgotten. Daniel Whitmore's jaw tightened, his composure slipping just enough to reveal what this loss actually meant, not just financially, but reputationally, strategically, permanently. "You are willing to walk away from $900 million over perception," he said, the word perception carrying a quiet accusation, as if she were overreacting to something minor. Danielle did not flinch. "No," she replied, her voice steady, unshaken. "I am walking away from how you decided I should be perceived." The distinction landed clean, undeniable, leaving no room for reinterpretation. The skyline outside remained unchanged, the city moving forward as it always did, but inside that room, everything had shifted beyond recovery, because the deal was never just about money, and now everyone at that table understood that too late. The silence did not linger this time. It fractured, breaking into small, controlled reactions that no one could fully hide anymore, because the weight of what had just happened was too large to contain behind polished manners and rehearsed composure. One investor closed his folder completely, the soft click of leather snapping shut louder than it should have been, signaling something final without needing to say it. Another leaned back, exhaling slowly, eyes shifting between Richard Whitmore and Danielle, as if recalculating where power now actually sat in the room. The attorney finally lowered his pen, placing it flat against the table, no longer pretending there was anything left to document. Because there was not. The deal, for all practical purposes, was already gone. Daniel Whitmore ran a hand through his hair, a gesture too quick to be controlled, betraying the first real crack in the image he had maintained all evening. "This is not how deals of this scale are handled," he said, his voice tighter now, no longer smooth, no longer measured. "You do not walk away without exhausting every avenue." Danielle's gaze shifted to him briefly, not dismissive, not confrontational, just clear. "I do not exhaust myself trying to be respected in rooms that decided against it before I spoke," she replied. The sentence landed with a precision that left no space for argument, because it was not about negotiation anymore. It was about a standard that had already been set. Richard Whitmore leaned forward again, his posture now fully engaged, the distance he once held gone completely. "Then name your terms," he said, his voice lower, more direct, as if finally acknowledging the only language that mattered. "What does it take to move forward from here?" The question was not rhetorical. It was an offer, one that would have shifted the outcome earlier in the evening, one that assumed everything still had a price. Danielle looked at him for a moment, long enough for the room to hold its breath again, but this time not in anticipation of opportunity, in recognition of its absence. "It is not about terms," she said quietly. "You are still trying to negotiate something that was already decided." Around the table, the realization settled deeper, heavier, because it meant there was no adjustment, no clause, no number that could bring the deal back. Ethan Cole sat back slowly, the tension in his shoulders releasing into something quieter, something closer to understanding. He had watched the entire arc unfold, from dismissal to recognition to loss, and now he understood that the outcome had been locked in long before the cancellation was spoken. Daniel Whitmore's voice rose slightly, not in volume, but in urgency. "You are making a strategic mistake," he said, leaning forward again, as if proximity could still change the trajectory. "Opportunities like this do not come twice." Danielle stood then, slowly, not abrupt, not dramatic, just enough to shift the entire room with a single movement. Every eye followed her. Every voice stopped, because standing, in that moment, meant the meeting was no longer in question. It was over. She gathered the document in front of her, aligning it once more with quiet precision before closing it completely. "Neither does this kind of first impression," she said. The words were not loud, but they carried further than anything spoken that night. No one responded, not because they did not want to, but because there was nothing left to say that would matter. The skyline outside remained steady, unchanged, but inside that room, the structure they had relied on had collapsed fully, leaving behind a silence that no one could control anymore. Danielle did not rush her exit. She did not gather her things in a hurry or look back to measure the damage she had left behind, because she already understood something the rest of the room was just beginning to process. The outcome had been decided the moment they chose how to see her. She stepped away from the table with the same calm precision she had carried into the room, her movements unhurried, controlled, as if nothing about the evening had been unexpected. Behind her, no one spoke at first. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy with realization, with calculations already shifting, with consequences beginning to take shape in ways that could not be reversed. Richard Whitmore remained seated, his hands still resting on the table, but the authority he once projected now sat differently, quieter, contained, as if the weight of what had just been lost had settled directly in front of him. Daniel Whitmore stared down at the closed contract, his jaw tight, his posture rigid, the earlier certainty replaced by something far less stable. Around them, the investors exchanged brief glances, subtle but unmistakable, each one understanding that the deal they had expected to close that night had dissolved not because of numbers, but because of something far more difficult to control. Ethan Cole sat still, his eyes following Danielle as she reached the door, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition. He had witnessed the full arc, from dismissal to consequence, and now he understood the part most people missed. Power did not always announce itself. Sometimes it waited. Sometimes it let others define it incorrectly until the cost of that mistake became impossible to recover from. Danielle paused briefly at the door, not turning back fully, not reopening the conversation, but allowing one final moment to exist before she left the room behind. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm, steady, carrying just enough to reach every person at the table without needing to rise. The deal was never the leverage, she said. The words settled into the room with quiet finality, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. She opened the door and stepped out into the corridor, where the noise of the city returned in distant layers, traffic moving, conversations continuing, the world outside unaffected by what had just happened inside that room. And that was the point. Because while the Whitmores and everyone at that table would spend the next hours, days, and weeks trying to understand how a $900 million opportunity disappeared in less than an hour, Danielle Carter would not need to revisit it at all. She had not raised her voice. She had not argued for her place. She had not demanded recognition. She had simply allowed the truth to reveal itself and then acted on it without hesitation. Inside the room, no one moved to follow her. No one called her back, because they understood, finally, that the opportunity they lost was not just financial. It was access. Access to someone who had already decided that respect was not something to negotiate for. And once that decision was made, there was nothing left to salvage. The skyline remained unchanged, the city lights steady against the night. But for the people still sitting at that table, something had shifted permanently. Not in the market, not in the numbers, in the standard, and they had failed to meet it.